She stood in the rain outside the most expensive hotel in Seoul, watching the man she loved press his lips against another woman's hair through the lobby glass. 2 years. 2 years of believing she was enough. Then she heard it, his voice carrying through the revolving door, casual and cold, like he was commenting on the weather. I was never attracted to her. She was too fat, too dark. The woman on his arm laughed. Imani Okoye did not move, did not breathe, did not make a sound. She simply stood there while Seoul's rain erased her. If you've ever been made to feel like you were too much of something, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let me see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything. The rain had been falling since 7 o'clock that evening. The kind of Seoul rain that didn't apologize for itself. Heavy, indifferent, relentless. It came down in thick curtains across Gangnam, blurring the golden lights of the Aurelia Grand Hotel into something that looked almost beautiful from a distance. Imani Okoye had always been good at appreciating beauty from a distance. She stood on the pavement across the street, her trench coat already soaked through the shoulders, her braids pressed flat against the side of her face. She'd been standing there for 11 minutes. She knew because she'd checked her phone twice and then stopped checking because looking at the time made the waiting feel too deliberate. She wasn't waiting. She was simply pausing. That's what she told herself. She was pausing outside the hotel where she worked, in the rain, at 9:45 on a Tuesday night, because Adrian had texted her 40 minutes ago asking her to meet him in the lobby. I need to see you. Important. 2 sentences. No context. She had learned over 2 years that Adrian Cho communicated in fragments when he was nervous and in complete paragraphs when he was performing. Tonight's fragment had felt like honesty. She should have known better. Honesty had never been Adrian's native language. She saw him through the glass before she crossed the street. He was standing near the concierge desk in his charcoal blazer, the Italian one he wore when he wanted people to take him seriously, and for a single, stupid moment, something softened in Imani's chest. He was still handsome. That had never been the problem. Adrian Cho was the kind of man who took up the right amount of space in a room, who smiled at exactly the right moments, who remembered the names of waiters and the birthdays of business partners. He was thoughtful in the ways that were easy to be thoughtful, in the ways that required no cost. Then she saw the woman. She appeared from the direction of the elevators, tall, ivory-skinned, draped in a silk dress the color of champagne, her dark hair pinned up in a way that looked effortless and had probably taken an hour. She walked toward Adrian with the specific confidence of a woman who had never once wondered whether she belonged in a room. She didn't hurry. She didn't have to. Adrian turned, and his face did something that 2 years of relationship had never once produced for Imani. It opened. Completely. Like a man finally setting down something very heavy. Imani's feet stopped moving. She was still on the pavement, still in the rain, watching through the glass as Adrian's arms went around the woman's waist with a familiarity that wasn't new. That was the detail that landed like a fist. Not that he was touching her, but how naturally he did it. The way you touch someone whose body you already know. She might have walked away then. She probably should have. But her legs had apparently decided to betray the rest of her, and she was still standing there when the revolving door exhaled 2 men in suits and carried their conversation briefly into the wet night air. She didn't hear all of it. She heard enough. Cho's new one? She's different from the last one. A pause. Then Adrian's voice, closer to the door than she'd realized, wrapped in the particular ease of a man who believed no one important was listening. Different is generous. I don't know what I was thinking. 2 years, man. A short laugh. She was never really my type. Too fat, too dark. I kept thinking she'd... The door turned again and swallowed the rest of it. The rain filled the silence. Imani's hand was pressed flat against her sternum, though she hadn't noticed putting it there. Her lungs were doing something strange, working harder than the situation required, pulling in air that tasted like exhaust and wet concrete. She was aware of her own body in the way you became aware of it when something inside was trying very hard not to react. Too fat, too dark. She had heard variations of this before. Of course she had. She was a black woman living in Seoul, a city she loved with the specific, complicated love you developed for places that didn't always love you back. She had navigated 1,000 small adjustments over the years, The colleagues who complimented her work and then looked mildly surprised when they did it. The clients who asked to speak to the senior manager and then blinked when she extended her hand. The beauty standards that existed around her like a permanent weather system she was not equipped for. She had developed a thick skin. She had built a professional life that commanded respect. She had refused, stubbornly and daily, to make herself smaller. And still, 2 years. 2 years she had given this man her patience, her time, her careful and deliberate trust. She had talked herself out of her own doubts 100 times. She had told herself that the distance she sometimes felt in Adrian was simply his personality, that some people showed love quietly, in practical ways, that not every man expressed warmth through warmth. She had been very creative in her explanations. And all this time he had been looking at her body and seeing a compromise. She didn't cry. This was not a crying moment. Crying would have required a kind of emotional access that her nervous system had simply shut a door on. What she felt instead was something flatter and more total, a cold, spreading numbness that moved from her chest outward until even the rain on her face felt like it was happening to someone else. She turned around. She walked. The Aurelia Grand stood behind her in the rain, its golden lights bleeding into the puddles on the pavement, and Imani Okoye walked away from it without looking back. This was where she worked. This was where she had built 4 years of professional reputation, managed 3 major renovations, handled 12 international VIP accounts. Tomorrow morning, she would be required to return to this building and perform the function of a composed, competent hospitality executive. She was aware of this. She filed it somewhere practical and kept walking. She had made it half a block when something made her stop. She wasn't sure why she looked. There was no reason to. There were dozens of cars parked along the hotel's curved entrance, mostly black, mostly expensive, mostly identical to each other in their careful statements of wealth. But something about this particular car pulled at her peripheral vision the way a held breath pulled at a room. A black Rolls-Royce, parked directly beneath the hotel's last functioning entrance light. Not in a designated space, slightly off, as though it had arrived and simply declined to conform to the architecture's expectations. The rear window was lowered by perhaps 4 inches. A man sat in the back seat. She couldn't have said what made her register him as distinct from the vehicle. The tinted glass should have obscured him. The rain and the distance should have reduced him to a shape. But she was looking at his face. Or rather, she was looking at his eyes, which were looking directly back at her with an attention that was neither predatory nor performative. It was simply precise. Like a man who had decided something was worth noting and was noting it without any particular apology. He didn't move, didn't lift a hand, didn't offer any of the gestures that men usually offered when they wanted a woman to know they'd seen her. He simply looked, with the full, unhurried weight of someone who was accustomed to looking at things until he understood them. Imani held his gaze for 3 seconds. She counted, without knowing why. And then she turned away and walked into the rain and didn't look back. She told herself the encounter meant nothing. She told herself a lot of things that night. The Aurelia Grand Hotel occupied 14 floors of a building that had been constructed in 1987 and renovated 5 times since, each renovation adding another layer of expensive intention until the hotel had become a kind of architectural palimpsest. If you knew where to look, you could still find, beneath the Italian marble and the custom lighting installations, evidence of the modest business hotel it had originally been. Imani found this fact obscurely comforting. She liked things that held their history while pretending to move past it. She recognized the behavior. She arrived the next morning at 7:45, earlier than required, because she had not slept and lying in her apartment staring at the ceiling had felt like an activity she needed to quit before it became a habit. She had washed her face with cold water. She had redone 2 of the braids that had frayed in the rain. She had chosen a blouse that was neither aggressive nor apologetic, and heels that said she had not been destroyed by anything overnight, which was, she felt, a reasonable aspiration. The lobby was doing its usual pre-peak choreography, housekeeping crossing between the elevators and the service corridor, the overnight front desk handing over to the morning team, the florist arriving with a cart of fresh arrangements for the entrance. Imani moved through it by instinct, nodding to the people who acknowledged her, pausing briefly to redirect a linen delivery that had arrived 40 minutes early and had no business being near the east entrance before 9. She was halfway to her office when her deputy manager, Min Seok, materialized at her left shoulder with the specific energy of a man who had been waiting for her and had practiced the first sentence. "We have a situation," he said. "Define situation." VIP arrival. Unscheduled. "We got the call at 6 this morning. 1 hour notice, which the booking team is still not over. Presidential suite is occupied by the Tamura group until Thursday." Imani kept walking. "So move the Tamura group." "We tried." Mr. Tamura's assistant said, and I am quoting directly, that Mr. Tamura would sooner check out than be moved to a lesser suite. "Then let him check out." Min Seok blinked. This was the answer he'd been hoping for, but not the one he'd expected. "The account is worth—" "I know what the account is worth." She stopped outside her office door. "What's the VIP situation?" Min Seok straightened. She could see him recalibrating, switching from the version of this conversation he'd rehearsed to something more direct. "Kwon Jae-hyun," he said. The name landed differently than most names landed in professional spaces. It had a specific weight, the kind produced not by volume, but by the opposite of volume. Kwon Jae-hyun was not a man who appeared in headlines. He was a man who appeared in the spaces between headlines, in the careful omissions of financial journalists, in the lowered voices of corporate lawyers. He controlled interests across shipping, technology, and private infrastructure that collectively accounted for a larger GDP contribution than several mid-sized nations. He was 41 years old. He was unmarried. He had not given a public interview in 7 years. People in Seoul's hospitality industry discussed him the way sailors once discussed certain stretches of ocean, with a mixture of professional respect and the understanding that you were operating in conditions that did not respond normally to standard navigation. "He's arriving at 10, Min Seok said. He specifically requested the Aurelia. He doesn't usually. He has properties, his own. He doesn't typically use rooms." "Correct. So this is unusual." Imani opened her office door. "Get the presidential suite ready. Move the Tamura group to the ambassador suite with a full complimentary service package and a personal apology from me. Tell them the building has a minor mechanical issue on their floor. Credible, not alarming. And I want every staff member who will be working the 14th floor briefed before 9:30. "On what specifically?" She set her bag down and turned to face him. "On the difference between professional discretion and paralysis. Mr. Kwon is a guest. He is not a weather event. He is not a myth. He is a person who requires a room, and we are a hotel. Treat him accordingly." Min Seok looked at her for a moment with something that might have been admiration if he'd been the type to express it. "Understood." He left. Imani sat down at her desk and looked at her reflection in the darkened monitor screen for a moment before turning it on. Too fat. Too dark. She turned the monitor on. He arrived at 9:58, which was 2 minutes early, and therefore, in the language of men like Kwon Jae-hyun, precisely on time. Imani was in the lobby because she had decided to be in the lobby, which was not strictly required of a hospitality director, but was the kind of choice she made when her instincts told her that proximity mattered. She stood near the concierge desk, reviewing a printed amendment to the week's event schedule when the main entrance doors parted. He didn't rush in. He arrived. There was a difference. 3 men preceded him, moving with the compact efficiency of people whose professional purpose was spatial awareness. Then Kwon Jae-hyun crossed the threshold of the Aurelia Grand Hotel, and the lobby did something that lobbies didn't usually do. It reorganized itself around his presence without anyone appearing to decide to. He was taller than she'd expected, which was an odd observation given that she hadn't been expecting anything. He wore a dark suit with no tie, the collar of his shirt open by one button in a way that read less as casual and more as deliberate. A man who had decided that a certain degree of formality was optional and had made that decision so thoroughly that it no longer registered as a choice. His face was composed in the particular way that came not from the suppression of expression, but from an apparent absence of any need to perform one. His team split toward the check-in desk. He didn't follow. He stood in the center of the lobby and looked at it. Not appraisingly, not the way wealthy people sometimes looked at hotels, calculating the ratio of their expenditure to the quality of their return. He looked at it the way you looked at a room you were trying to actually see before you decided what you thought of it. Then he looked at Imani. She didn't look away. This was not bravery. It was simply the fact that she was doing her job and her job required looking at the lobby, and he was standing in the lobby and looking away would have been the deliberate act, not the looking. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A small recalibration, as though her failure to redirect her gaze had answered a question he hadn't quite finished formulating. He walked toward her. His security didn't follow. They either trusted his judgment or understood that some approaches required privacy, and she found she couldn't tell which. "You're the director," he said. It was not a question. "Imani Okoye." She extended her hand. "Welcome to the Aurelia, Mr. Kwan." He shook it. His grip was brief and unperformative. "You don't look nervous," he said. "I'm not." He studied her for a moment. "Everyone else in this room is." She glanced briefly at the lobby, at Min Seok, frozen near the elevator bank, at the front desk staff whose performance of normalcy had the slightly rigid quality of people trying very hard. "Yes," she said. "They are." "Why aren't you?" "Because you're a guest," she said, "not a weather event." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the structural precursor to one. "Room ready?" 14th floor. I'll take you up myself." She moved toward the elevator without making a production of it. He followed, and behind them she heard the lobby exhale. In the elevator he stood on the opposite side of the space and looked at the floor indicator. She looked at it too. Neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. "You moved someone for my suite," he said. Not accusatory, just noting. "I did." "Were they unhappy?" "They'll recover." Another almost smile. The elevator doors opened and she led him down the hall to the presidential suite, produced the key card, opened the door, and stepped back to let him enter. He walked in and stood in the center of the room and did the same thing he'd done in the lobby, simply looked at it, as though looking was something he took seriously. "It's adequate," he said finally. "I'll let adequate know you approved." This time he actually looked at her, for a full 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, she had the distinct and disorienting sensation that Kwon Jae-hyun was not assessing the room or the hotel or the adequacy of the suite, but something else entirely, something he had not yet decided how to address. "Thank you, Ms. Okoye," he said. She nodded and left. She rode the elevator back down to the lobby and stood in it for a moment. Min Seok appeared immediately. "How was—" "Fine," she said. He settled. "Did he seem like a guest?" she said. "He seemed like a guest." She went back to her office and sat down and noticed that her hands were completely steady. She wasn't sure if that was professional competence or the fact that she was still running on the numbness from last night, that flat cold thing that had settled over everything and made the world feel like something she was watching from a slight remove. Either way, it served the same function. She picked up her phone and saw 4 messages from Adrian. She set the phone face down without reading them. The pastry appeared the following morning. It was sitting on her desk when she arrived at 7:50. A single item from the hotel's specialty bakery, the one that opened at 6 for the breakfast service. A honey walnut pastry, which was not on the regular menu but was something the pastry chef made once a week for the staff, a fact that required either insider knowledge of the hotel's informal operations or the kind of quiet observation that most guests didn't bother with. There was no note. She stood looking at it for a moment, then she sat down and ate it, because she had not eaten breakfast, and she was not in the habit of performing suspicion when a simpler explanation was available. At 11:15, she received a call that a guest on the 14th floor had requested a consultation with the hospitality director regarding an issue with the suite's environmental controls. She went up. The environmental controls were functioning perfectly. Kwon Jae-hyun was standing at the window looking down at the street when she arrived, his jacket off, his expression arranged in the same specific neutrality she was becoming familiar with. "There's nothing wrong with the controls," she said. "No," he agreed. She waited. "I wanted to ask you something," he said, still looking at the window. "Whether you were all right." The question landed strangely. "I'm fine," she said. "Is there a specific concern?" "You were standing in the rain outside this hotel on Tuesday night." He turned to look at her. His eyes were very direct. "For approximately 11 minutes, before you left." The silence in the room shifted quality. "That's a fairly specific observation," she said. "I'm a fairly specific person." She looked at him and tried to determine what exactly was being offered here, whether this was the opening move of something she recognized, some version of powerful man notices woman who has been diminished, steps in to provide contrast. She had enough experience to know that that story could look like a lot of things from the outside, and very few of them were what they appeared to be. "I'm fine," she said again. Cleaner this time. He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said, simply, without pressing. He turned back to the window. "The room is fine, Ms. Okoye. Thank you for coming up." She left. In the elevator, she looked at her reflection in the polished doors and tried to locate the feeling that was sitting just below her sternum. Something between guardedness and something else. Something she didn't have a clean word for. The sensation of a person being looked at carefully and not found wanting. She didn't trust it. She didn't not trust it either. Adrian called 6 times before noon. She let all 6 go to voicemail. She was in a site meeting with the renovation team on the 2nd floor when her assistant forwarded a message. He came to the front desk. "I told him you were unavailable. He left something at the desk. Do you want me to—" She typed back, "Dispose of it." There was a pause, then, "It's flowers. Dispose of it." The renovation meeting ran 40 minutes over schedule because the contractor had discovered that one of the internal walls they'd planned to remove was load-bearing, a fact that the structural assessment from 2 months ago had failed to note, which meant the entire layout concept needed to be reconsidered. Imani stood in the half-gutted room surrounded by exposed concrete and rerouted electrical cabling and listened to 3 men explain, with increasing creativity, how this was not their fault. She let them finish. Then she told them clearly and without escalation what was going to happen next, and how, and by when, and that the failure of the assessment was a contractual issue that would be addressed separately and should not be confused with the current operational problem, which required a solution before it required an attribution. By the time she got back to her office, it was past 3. Her phone had 17 notifications. 15 of them were work. 2 were Adrian. She read the work ones. She was still reading when her office door opened without a knock, and Adrian Cho walked in. He looked good. She noticed this in the same dispassionate way she had been noticing things for the past 18 hours, cataloging them, giving them their accurate weight, not inflating them with feelings she didn't currently have access to. He'd had a haircut since Tuesday. He was carrying a different set of flowers from the ones she'd disposed of, which suggested he'd been to a second florist. "You've been ignoring me," he said. "I've been working." "Imani, you need to leave," she said. "This is my workplace and you're not a guest here and you need to leave." "I need to explain." "Adrian." Her voice came out very flat. "I heard you on Tuesday night. I was standing outside the lobby. I heard everything." The color moved in his face, a complicated mobile thing, guilt running ahead of calculation. "It wasn't— I don't need you to tell me what it was." She stood up. "I need you to leave this building before I ask security to assist you." 2 years, he said. "You're not even going to let me?" 2 years, she agreed. "And in 2 years, you managed to be in a relationship with a woman you were simultaneously describing to other people as too fat and too dark." She kept her voice even. This was important. She was not going to give him the version of this where she cried, where she raged, where she provided him with the spectacle of a woman breaking down because of what he thought of her body. She was going to give him the version where she was utterly clear. "That's the information I have. I don't need more information. I need you to leave." He stood there for a moment. She could see him cycling through his options: the apology, the explanation, the accusation, the wounded dignity. She watched him choose and discard each one. Then he left. She sat back down. She picked up her phone and then put it down and then picked it up again. Outside her window, Seoul was doing its early evening thing, the light changing quality, the traffic thickening, the city shifting gears from work to something louder. She watched it for a moment. Then her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words. "Dinner, if you want." She sat with it for a long time. Below the message, a second one arrived 30 seconds later. No obligation, just food. She looked at her reflection in the dark screen when the display timed out. Looked at the woman looking back at her. The woman who was too fat, too dark, too something. To herself, apparently. Too real for the size of life Adrian Cho had imagined for the two of them. She typed back, "How did you get this number?" The response came immediately. "I'm a fairly specific person." She stared at that for a moment. Then, against every instinct she'd spent 18 hours carefully constructing, she felt something, small and unsteady and entirely inconvenient, begin to shift. She didn't answer the message, but she didn't delete it either. And at 7:45 the following morning, when she arrived at work and found a second pastry on her desk, this time with a note that read only, "Rain is forecast at 3 p.m. She stood at her window and looked up at the sky, which was pale and cloudless and gave nothing away. At 2:57, it began to rain. And on her desk, next to her coffee, sat an umbrella she had not put there. She picked it up, held it in both hands, looked at it the way you looked at a thing that was asking you to decide something important. Down in the lobby, she knew without looking, a man with very precise eyes was going about his business in the unhurried way of someone who had learned that the things worth waiting for were worth waiting for properly. She had built walls for years. She had calibrated them carefully, reinforced them with competence and composure and a professional reputation solid enough to stand on. She had survived the accumulation of 100 small diminishments by refusing to let any single one define her. And now something was standing outside those walls, and it was not knocking, it was simply waiting, which was, she realized, the most unsettling approach of all. She set the umbrella back on her desk. Then she picked up her phone and typed, "Fine, dinner." She hit send before she could decide otherwise and spent the next 3 hours pretending to review quarterly reports, while something she had no clean name for moved quietly through her chest, like a tide coming in. She didn't know yet that 48 hours from now, she would discover something inside Kwon Jae-hyun's private suite that would make the pain of Tuesday night feel like a warm-up. She didn't know yet what was in the file. She didn't know yet what the file would cost her. She didn't know yet that sometimes the person who finds you is not the person you suspected. And sometimes the reason they found you is not the reason that you feared. And sometimes the truth is more complicated and more terrible and more tender than any lie you could have constructed to protect yourself. She only knew that outside her window, the rain was falling in steady sheets across the Seoul skyline, and for the first time in 3 days, she was not standing in it alone. The restaurant he chose was not what she expected. She had constructed in the 48 hours between agreeing to dinner and the dinner itself a fairly detailed anticipatory version of what a meal with Kwon Jae-hyun would look like. Private room, obsequious staff, the specific theater of extreme wealth performing its own casualness. She had prepared herself for it with the same professional composure she applied to everything. Acknowledge the environment, don't be impressed by it, do your job, which in this case was simply to eat food across from a man and determine what he wanted from her without letting him determine anything about her in return. The restaurant was a basement noodle place in Mapogu, 11 tables, fluorescent lighting, a laminated menu taped to the wall beside the ordering counter, and a smell, anchovy broth and sesame and something frying in oil, that hit her the moment she came down the steps and made her stomach remind her that she hadn't properly eaten since the honey walnut pastry 2 days ago. He was already there, sitting at a corner table, not a booth, not a private enclosure, just a corner table like anyone else, with his jacket on the back of the chair and his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a glass of barley tea in front of him that he had clearly poured himself from the communal jug on the table. No security she could see. This bothered her more than security would have. She sat down across from him. He looked at her in the direct, unperformative way she was becoming accustomed to and said, "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I said I would. People say a lot of things." She picked up the laminated menu. "Do you actually eat here, or is this a performance of normalcy?" Something moved in his expression. Not offense, she didn't think, but something like recalibration. "I've been coming here for 6 years," he said. "The owner doesn't know who I am. I'd like to keep it that way." She looked at him over the top of the menu. "So what do I call you?" "Jae-hyun is fine." She set the menu down. "That's going to take some adjustment." "Why?" "Because Mr. Kwon is a person my professional framework knows how to manage," she said. "Jae-hyun is—" She paused, looking for the right word and not quite finding it. "Different information." He looked at her steadily. "Is that a problem?" "I haven't decided yet." The owner's wife came and took their order. He ordered without looking at the menu. the kind of ease that came from actual familiarity. Imani ordered the same thing, which was either unsophisticated or efficient, and she decided it was efficient. When the woman left, the silence came back. It was a different silence from the elevator silence, that one had been neutral, two people coexisting in a small space without friction. This one had a texture. Something in it was paying attention. "Why the Aurelia?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. He turned his glass on the table. "I've stayed in my own properties for 4 years. Every room and every building I own has been optimized to my preferences by a team of people whose job it is to anticipate what I want before I know I want it." He paused. "It becomes suffocating," she said. He looked at her. "Yes. You wanted something that hadn't been arranged around you. I wanted a room someone else was responsible for," he said. "That's all." The food arrived faster than expected. The broth still boiling at the edges of the bowl, a pile of hand-cut noodles, a plate of banchan in small ceramic dishes. She picked up her chopsticks and ate, and it was good. Genuinely, straightforwardly good, in the way that food was good when it wasn't trying to be anything other than food. He watched her for a moment before picking up his own chopsticks. "You look surprised," he said. "I am," she said. "I was expecting a performance." "Of what?" "Wealth apologizing for itself. Men with money who take you to cheap restaurants so you'll think they're uncomplicated." She looked at him. "Are you uncomplicated?" The pause before he answered was a fraction too long. "No," he said. "Good," she said. "Uncomplicated people make me nervous." He ate. She ate. Outside, the Mapogu street noise came down through the small basement windows in fragments. A delivery scooter, someone's music, the compressed rush of a passing bus. "The man who was in the lobby," he said, not carefully, just directly, placing it on the table between them. "The one you saw." She kept eating. "What about him?" "He came to the hotel again yesterday, asked for you at the desk." "I know." "He left flowers." "I had them disposed of." Jae-hyun looked at his bowl. "Is he the reason you were standing in the rain?" "That's a personal question for a first dinner." "Yes," he said. She set her chopsticks down and looked at him. Really looked. Past the composure, past the specific gravity of who he was in the world, at the man sitting in a basement noodle place with his sleeves rolled up, drinking communal barley tea. He looked back without flinching, without filling the space she was giving him. 2 years, she said finally. "I was with him for 2 years. And I heard, standing outside that lobby in the rain, I heard him tell someone that he was never attracted to me, that I was—" She stopped. Not because she couldn't say it, because she was deciding whether this man had earned the words yet. That I was too fat, too dark. The silence that followed was different from the others. "I see," Jae-hyun said, quietly. No additional commentary, no rush to fill the space with reassurance, no instinct to immediately produce a counter-narrative about her worth. He simply absorbed it. Let it sit in the room as the actual thing that it was. She had not expected that. She had expected, if she was being honest, something corrective. Some version of "that's not true," or "he was wrong." The reflexive male response to female pain that was less about the pain and more about discomfort with sitting in the room with it. The fact that he offered none of this left her with a feeling she couldn't immediately categorize. "That's all?" she said. "What else would you like me to say?" "Most people say something reassuring. Most people find other people's pain inconvenient," he said. "Reassurance is usually about ending the discomfort, not acknowledging it." He picked up his chopsticks again. "You don't need me to tell you he was wrong. You know he was wrong. You knew it standing in the rain. The problem isn't doubt about the facts." She looked at him. "What's the problem then?" "That knowing something and feeling it are different operations," he said. "And the second one takes longer." She picked up her chopsticks and ate, and didn't say anything for a while, and neither did he, and the noodle shop carried on around them with its fluorescent indifference. And she thought, this is either the most genuine interaction she had experienced with a man in several years, or it was a performance so sophisticated that she had no instrument capable of detecting it. She didn't know which. She found she didn't know, and that unknowing was the most honest thing she'd felt in days. Adrian Cho was not handling things well, This was not, in the abstract, surprising. Adrian's relationship with outcomes he hadn't engineered was historically poor, but the specific way he was not handling things was new, and it had a quality that the people around him were beginning to find concerning. He had always been controlled. Controlled was one of his primary professional assets. Controlled was how he had navigated Seoul's elite business circuits, how he had cultivated the right connections, how he had positioned himself as a man of measured judgment and careful alliances. The controlled version of Adrian Cho would have absorbed Tuesday night as a minor setback, recalibrated, moved on. He was technically the one who had ended things, or rather, things had been ending for months, and Tuesday had simply been the confirmation of a fact already in progress. But then his friend had mentioned, with the specific energy of someone passing on information they knew would cause a reaction, that Kwon Jae-hyun was staying at the Aurelia Grand. And then someone else had mentioned that Kwon Jae-hyun had been seen leaving the hotel in civilian clothes without his security detail at 7:30 on a Thursday evening. And then a third person, a woman Adrian had slept with twice and maintained primarily as a social intelligence source, had mentioned that a woman matching Imani's description had been seen entering a restaurant in Mapogu around the same time. He had put these three pieces of information together, and something in him that was not controlled at all had made a very sharp sound. He sat in his apartment on Saturday morning and looked at his phone, and then at the wall, and then at his phone again. He had the number of a journalist, not a reputable one, but a functional one, a man who operated in the specific ecosystem of rumor-adjacent media that serviced Seoul's wealthy and their enemies in roughly equal measure. A man who had once told Adrian at a dinner party that there was always a story around Kwon Jae-hyun if you knew where to look, and that he was always looking. Adrian picked up his phone. He told himself this was not about Imani. He told himself this was about legitimate concerns regarding a dangerous man's presence in a public hotel. He built a fairly elaborate internal structure around this premise and stood inside it while he dialed. The call lasted 6 minutes. When it ended, he set his phone down and looked at his hands. They were completely steady, which he found, obscurely, more disturbing than if they'd shaken. The story appeared online on Monday. It was not technically a story. It was a post on one of the aggregator platforms that occupied the gray space between journalism and speculation, the kind of content that framed everything as a question so it could plausibly deny the assertions it was making. The headline read, Kwon Jae-hyun's mysterious extended stay. Who is the Aurelia Grand's foreign hospitality director? Imani read it at her desk at 8:47 in the morning, sent by Min Seok, with a message that said simply, "You need to see this." She read it twice. The article itself was thin. It had correctly identified her name and position, had pulled her professional profile from the hotel's public website, and had produced from somewhere a photograph of her. A real one, not her work headshot. It was candid, taken from a distance, and she was fairly certain it was from the previous Thursday. She was wearing the coat she'd worn to Mapogu, and the street in the background was consistent with that neighborhood. Someone had been watching. Below the article, the comments had begun accumulating with a specific velocity of online engagement that smelled blood. She read 3 of them and stopped. They were variations on a theme: her body, her skin, her hair. The question of what someone like Kwon Jae-hyun could possibly want with someone like her. The question was not really a question. She closed the browser. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. Her office felt both very small and very still. Outside her window, the hotel was opening into its Monday morning operations. She could hear the luggage carts in the corridor, the faint chime of the elevator, the low organizational hum of a building doing its job. She picked up her phone and called the hotel's communications manager and told her to prepare a standard no-comment response to any media inquiries. She called the front desk and reminded them that no information about any guest was to be shared with anyone for any reason. She called Min Seok and told him to review the last 72 hours of lobby camera footage and identify anyone who had been in the public areas without a clear guest or business purpose. Then she did the part of her job that didn't have a procedural response. She sat with it. She was familiar with this kind of attack. Not the specifics, but the architecture. The way that commentary about women like her always found a way back to the same territory. The body, the skin. The fundamental question of whether she warranted the space she occupied. She had been refusing to answer that question her entire professional life, and she had gotten very good at the refusal, but getting good at something didn't mean it stopped costing you. It just meant the cost was more controlled. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered because she'd been answering unknown numbers for the past week with a frequency that had apparently become a new habit. I saw the piece, Jae-hyun said. I'm handling it. I know you are. A pause. I wanted to ask if you were all right. You asked me that before. You said you were fine. I am fine. Imani. His voice was very even. There was something in the evenness that was not coldness. It was the specific calm of a person who had learned to construct it from whatever they'd originally had before life taught them the necessity. She recognized it because she had built the same thing, from different materials, for the same reasons. She said nothing for a moment. Her window threw a rectangle of pale light across her desk. The comments, she said carefully. They found the photograph from Thursday. Someone was watching us. Yes, he said. I know who. Something in her went very still. Who? A pause. I'd like to tell you that in person. I'm at work. I know, lunch, not a performance, just information you need to have. She looked at the closed browser on her monitor. She thought about the comment section she'd read 3 lines of and stopped. She thought about the woman in that photograph, the one she hadn't known was being taken, walking through a Mapogu street in the early evening. Looking, she realized now with a faint, sick feeling, almost happy. 1 o'clock, she said. The hotel's private dining room. I'm not going outside today. Understood. She hung up. She opened her email and spent the next 3 hours doing her job with the focused determination of a woman who had learned that competence was its own form of armor, that the most effective response to people who wanted to see you reduced was to be consistently and visibly unreduced. At 12:45, Min Seok appeared in her doorway. His face had the look it got when he was carrying information he hadn't wanted to be the person to carry. The lobby footage, he said. What about it? Thursday evening, 40 minutes before your... He hesitated. Before you left, there was a man in the lobby. He was there for about 25 minutes, sat at the lounge, had a coffee, left. Min Seok paused. I recognized him. He's been here before, as a guest 2 years ago. His name is... Adrian, she said. Min Seok blinked. Yes. She looked at her desk. Thank you, Min Seok. He left. She sat for a moment with the specific feeling of something clicking into place, a mechanism completing itself, a lock engaging. Adrian had been in the lobby. He had been there long enough to observe. He had left before she arrived, or perhaps after. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the photograph existed, and that it had found its way to a journalist, and that the only person in her life with both the motive and the connections to make that happen was a man who had told a friend she was too fat and too dark. She felt, suddenly and cleanly, furious. Not the hot panicked kind of fury, the cold structural kind, the kind that organized itself immediately into a series of logical steps. She was not going to fall apart. She was not going to perform distress. She was going to walk into the private dining room at 1 o'clock and hear what Jae-hyun had to tell her, and then she was going to make some very careful decisions. He was already there when she arrived. The private dining room was a small space off the main restaurant, used for corporate lunches and the occasional wedding planning consultation, its glass doors currently frosted for privacy. He'd arranged for a simple spread, 2 bowls of something hot, tea, no flowers, no gestures. She sat down and looked at him. Tell me, she said. The journalist's name is Park Sung-won. He operates in the finance-adjacent gossip sector. He received information about my stay here, specifically that I had been seen off-property in civilian clothes with a hotel employee. He poured tea into her cup without asking. I have a team that monitors this ecosystem. They trace the initial contact back within 12 hours. To Adrian. To a phone registered to Adrian Cho, yes. He set the teapot down. I want to be clear that I didn't surveil him specifically. This was standard monitoring of my own exposure. I'm not concerned about how you found out, she said. I'm concerned about what he's going to do next. He'll escalate, Jae-hyun said. He doesn't have enough real information to produce serious damage, but he doesn't need real information in this environment. He needs narrative. He looked at her steadily. The narrative he's constructing is that you and I are... I understand the narrative. It will likely focus on you more than on me, he said. There was something careful in how he delivered this. Not delicacy, exactly, but precision. An awareness that this particular truth required honesty rather than softening. That's how these things work. The powerful man faces temporary reputational noise. The woman involved absorbs the actual damage. She picked up her tea. Her hands were steady. She hated how often she was noticing that her hands were steady, as though her nervous system had decided that steadiness was the appropriate response to everything and was committed to demonstrating it constantly. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "You could have managed this quietly, on your side, without involving me." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. A slight recession of the composure, like a window opening briefly. "Because you deserve to know what's being done to you," he said. "And because..." He stopped. "Because..." she said. He looked at his bowl. "Because I find that I am not interested in protecting you without your knowledge. That distinction matters to me." He picked up his chopsticks. "Eat. The soup gets bitter when it cools." She ate. He ate. Between them, the thing he had almost said settled into the room, and she decided, consciously, not to excavate it. Not yet. They were halfway through the meal when her work phone buzzed on the table. A forwarded email from the communications manager. She glanced at it. Park Sung-won had contacted the hotel for comment on a follow-up piece. The subject line of his email was, Kwon Jae-hyun, connection to foreign employee. Additional information requested. She set the phone face down. "He's moving fast," she said. "He always does when someone is paying him to." She looked at Jae-hyun. "What are you going to do about it?" "Nothing, yet," he said, "which I understand is unsatisfying. But acting directly on Cho right now gives the story a second chapter it doesn't currently have. Patience is more effective." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're used to playing long games." "Yes." "I'm not," she said. "I'm used to managing immediate situations." "I know," he said. I know." There was something in the repetition that wasn't quite hesitation. It was the sound of a man choosing his next words with a care that suggested they mattered. He chose silence instead. She accepted it. She went back to work at 2:15 and spent the rest of the afternoon managing 3 separate operational crises with a focus so concentrated it was almost meditative. She didn't look at any online content. She didn't respond to Adrian's latest message, which had arrived while she was in the private dining room and read, "I know you're with him. You should know what kind of man he is." She deleted it. She didn't delete the image it left behind. The specific unease of a warning delivered by someone whose motivations made the warning itself suspect. She filed it in the part of her mind reserved for things that needed watching and kept moving. At 6:45, her day structurally complete, she walked to the 14th floor, her habit, checking that the executive level was properly settled for the evening. The hallway was quiet. The cleaning staff had finished. The evening lights had engaged. She was passing the presidential suite when she stopped. The door was not fully closed, not open, not swinging, not ajar in a way that would register immediately as a problem, just not fully latched. A gap of perhaps 3 centimeters, which suggested the mechanism hadn't engaged properly when it was last closed. She stepped forward to test it, and the door swung inward with the easy smoothness of a properly hinged thing, and she was inside the suite before the consideration of whether she should be had fully processed. The suite was empty. He wasn't here. She could feel the absence of a person, the specific quality of a space holding its breath between occupants. His jacket was on the chair. A glass of water, half finished, sat on the desk beside his laptop. She should have stepped back out immediately. She knew this. She was aware of the line as she approached it, and aware of crossing it. And she did it anyway, because there was something on the desk beside the laptop that her eyes had caught and could not unacquire. A folder. Dark leather, well worn. Open. She stepped closer. She told herself she was going to look only long enough to determine whether she had misunderstood what she was seeing. She had not misunderstood. Her own name was at the top of the first visible page. Her full name, Imani Okoye, in clean print above a column of dates. Below the dates, a list. Her immigration records. The apartment in Adawan she'd lived in her first year. Her employment history. Every position. Every performance review that had been part of any formal database. Financial records. Bank statements. The amount she had sent home to her grandmother in Johannesburg every third month for 6 years. Photographs. Not surveillance style. Not taken without her knowledge, but reconstructed. Her graduation photograph. A family photo. A picture of her at a previous hotel event that had been published in a hospitality industry newsletter. Her hands were not steady anymore. She turned the page. Another page. A document that appeared to be a translated report. South Africa, Johannesburg, a specific neighborhood, a specific year. Name she recognized. Her grandmother's name. Her mother's name. A name below her mother's name with a red annotation beside it that she couldn't immediately parse because her vision had gone slightly strange, the room both very clear and very far away. She stepped back from the desk. She set the folder down exactly where she had found it, with the same degree of openness, the same page visible. She walked out of the suite and pulled the door closed behind her, and this time it latched properly. She stood in the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed their single toneless note above her. Somewhere on a lower floor, an elevator arrived with a distant chime. The building held its breath around her. He had found her. Not randomly, not incidentally. He had built a file. He had done research she couldn't measure the full depth of yet, had gathered information from years before they met, had assembled her life into a document and kept it in a leather folder in the room she was professionally responsible for, and he had never, not once, not in any of the conversations, or the silences, or the pastries, or the umbrella, or the dinner in Mapogu, he had never said a single word about any of it. She took one breath, then another. Then she walked to the elevator and rode it down to the lobby, and walked through the lobby and out of the hotel and into the Seoul evening, and this time she did not look at any black cars parked beneath any hotel lights, and she did not stop walking until she was 3 blocks away. And when she finally stopped, she was standing in front of a convenience store with its fluorescent window washing yellow light across the pavement, and she stood there and looked at nothing and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she was not going to be able to do what she'd told herself she would do. She was not going to confront him tonight, because confronting him required a version of herself that was currently unavailable. The version that could stand in a room with Kwon Jae-hyun and be sharp and controlled and managed, the version that had walked into his suite earlier in the week and told him he wasn't a weather event. That version had just discovered that she had been, for an unknown period of time, someone's. She stood outside the convenience store for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She knew the duration because the store's security camera had a red blinking light above the door, and she had been counting its pulses without deciding to, the way the mind reached for anything quantifiable when the rest of itself was coming apart. 14 pulses per minute, 4 minutes and 30 seconds. 252 blinks of a red light, while Imani Okoye stood on a Seoul pavement and tried to locate the version of herself that knew what to do next. The version didn't show up. She walked home instead. Her apartment in Yongsan was a 20-minute walk from the Aurelia Grand, close enough to be convenient, far enough that the distance had always served as a buffer between the woman she was at work and the woman she was when the work stopped. She had chosen it specifically for this reason 4 years ago. She had furnished it carefully, over time, with things she actually liked rather than things that performed a taste. A worn leather armchair she'd found in an Iriwan second-hand shop. 3 plants she had kept alive through disciplined inattention. A bookshelf organized not alphabetically or thematically, but by the approximate emotional temperature of each book, warmest on the left and coldest on the right. She sat in the leather armchair and looked at the bookshelf for a long time. The file had been comprehensive. That was the word her mind kept returning to. Not damning, not sinister, not the vocabulary of betrayal, but the dry, precise word, comprehensive. Someone had been thorough. Someone had gathered the pieces of her life with the systematic patience of a person who had a reason to know everything, and the file had been in that room for however long Jae-hyun had been at the Aurelia, and every conversation they'd had, every dinner, every pastry, every silence in the elevator had occurred on top of that hidden architecture. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the lobby on his first morning, that small recalibration she had noticed, the slight shift in his expression when she didn't look away. She had read it as interest, the natural interest of a person encountering another person and finding something worth looking at. Now she considered the alternative reading, recognition. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum and felt her own heartbeat there, faster than it should be, not racing but elevated, the body running a quiet emergency in the background while the mind tried to stay analytical. She was not going to cry. She had decided this somewhere between the hotel hallway and the convenience store, and she was maintaining the decision with the specific stubbornness of a woman who had learned that tears were fine, but timing mattered, and this was not the time. She needed information before she needed emotion. She picked up her phone and did what she hadn't done in the suite. She searched. Kwon Jae-hyun's name produced the usual controlled landscape. Financial coverage, infrastructure projects, the occasional society page reference that he appeared never to have encouraged. She searched his father. Kwon Dae-sung, who had died 11 years ago at the age of 73, whose obituary described a self-made industrialist of the old school, shipping, manufacturing, the unglamorous productive infrastructure of post-war Korean economic rebuilding. A man who had apparently been reclusive in the same manner as his son, whose personal history was thin in every public record she could find. She searched Kwon Dae-sung, South Africa. Nothing. She searched variations. Nothing relevant. She put the phone down and sat in the dark for a while, and then picked it up again and looked at the last message from Jae-hyun, sent 6 hours ago, before any of tonight had happened. Tomorrow, if you want to walk somewhere, no agenda. She looked at it for a long time. Then she put the phone face down on the armchair arm and did not pick it up again that night. She arrived at work the next morning at her normal time, wearing her normal clothes, performing the normal version of Imani Okoye with enough fidelity that Min Seok, who watched her with the particular attentiveness of a person who had worked alongside her long enough to read her weather patterns, noticed nothing in the first 40 minutes. He noticed in the 41st when she approved a vendor invoice she would normally have questioned and then corrected herself 30 seconds later. "Are you all right?" he asked, using the specific careful phrasing of a person who was not sure they wanted a truthful answer. "Fine," she said. "Pull that invoice back. I want the breakdown on the service charges." He pulled it back. He didn't ask again. She had decided, sometime in the gray pre-dawn hours of that morning, on a strategy. She was not going to confront Jae-hyun with what she'd seen until she understood more. This was not avoidance. She had spent considerable time distinguishing between avoidance and tactical patience, and she was confident in her categorization. What she needed was one conversation with one specific person before she sat across from Kwon Jae-hyun and asked him to explain the leather folder and everything inside it. She needed to talk to her grandmother. The time difference between Seoul and Johannesburg was 7 hours, which meant that 7 in the evening here was noon there, which meant she needed to get through a full workday before she could make the call she'd been building toward since 2 in the morning. She managed this by the method she always used when managing the unmanageable. She divided it into components, addressed each component in sequence, and did not allow herself to look at the whole shape of the thing until she was ready. At 11:15, she received a message from Jae-hyun. "The walk offer still stands. No agenda means no agenda." She read it. She did not respond. At 11:40, she looked up from her monitor to find that he was standing in her office doorway. He knocked on the open door once, a courtesy knock, the kind that wasn't asking permission so much as announcing presence. He was in his regular civilian configuration, dark jacket, collar open, the specific stillness that he carried like a physical property of his body. He looked at her, and she looked at him. And in the 3 seconds of that exchange, she was aware of the full complexity of what she was doing, which was looking at a man whose face she had begun, against every considered intention, to know, and simultaneously attempting to hold herself at a remove from that knowing until she understood what it had been built on. "You didn't respond," he said. "I was busy." "Are you busy now?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. She watched him read her, watched the small adjustments in his expression as he processed that the register of this conversation was different from the ones before it. He was perceptive. She had always known this. Right now she found it a liability. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. A man who had looked at the data and was naming what he saw. "I told you, I'm busy." He stepped into the office. One step, not further, maintaining a distance that was respectful or tactical. She couldn't determine which. Imani. Mr. Kwan. She said it deliberately, watching his face. I appreciate the walk invitation. I'm not available today. A silence. She could see him deciding. He was running through the same process she was, she realized. Gathering data, reading the room, choosing his approach. The difference was that he had more information than she did, and they both knew it, and only one of them knew that the other one knew. All right, he said finally, same word he'd used in the suite on the first day. Simply, without pressure. He left. She watched the doorway for a moment after he was gone. Then she turned back to her monitor and spent 4 hours not thinking about the folder. She called her grandmother at 7:12 in the evening, sitting on her living room floor with her back against the armchair, because somehow the floor felt more appropriate for this conversation than any piece of furniture designed for comfort. Her grandmother's name was Noma. Not a shortened name, just Noma, a woman of 76 who had raised Imani from the age of 7 with the specific blend of warmth and refusal that had produced over time a granddaughter who could stand in rain and not dissolve. She answered on the third ring, and her voice was exactly what it always was. Low, slightly rough, carrying in its texture all the decades of a life that had not been easy and had decided to be good anyway. Imani. Warmth. Then, immediately, what's wrong? Why does something have to be wrong? Because you're calling on a Tuesday and you sound like you're sitting on the floor. Imani looked down at the floor. Gran. Talk. She talked. Not everything, but not all of it, but the shape of it. The man at the hotel. The file. Her own name at the top of a page in a leather folder. Her grandmother's name inside it. The details she hadn't been able to make sense of on her own. When she finished, there was a silence on the line that was different from the pauses between sentences. A longer, heavier silence with something inside it. The specific silence of a person who has been waiting for a conversation for a very long time and has just been told it's arrived. Gran, Imani said, talk to me. How detailed was the file? Her grandmother asked. Her voice had changed, quieter, more careful. Very. Another silence. His father's name, Imani said, Kwan Dae-sung. Does that mean anything to you? The pause that followed was the longest yet. Outside Imani's window, Seoul was doing its nighttime transformation. The city's register shifting from productive noise to recreational noise, the quality of the light changing. She waited. Yes, her grandmother said finally. It means something. The word landed in Imani's chest like a stone dropped into still water. Tell me. Imani. Gran! Her voice came out flat and clean. Tell me. A breath on the other end of the line. Then, in 1987, your mother was working in Hong Kong. She was 23. She was working at a shipping logistics company. Low-level, administrative, she was saving money to come home. A pause. There was a man, Kwan Dae-sung. He was there for a business negotiation, a deal that had gone wrong in a way that had people watching him who should not have been watching him. People who were not interested in negotiation. Imani was very still on her floor. Your mother saw something, her grandmother said. She was in the building when something happened. She had information. She didn't know she had it, not at first. But the men who had been watching Kwan Dae-sung understood what she'd seen and what it meant, and they... Her grandmother stopped, started again. There was a night, a car. Your mother was put into a car with 2 strangers and taken to a safe location, and Kwan Dae-sung was there. And he told her that the people who had been watching him wanted her now because of what she'd witnessed, and that he was going to help her leave Hong Kong before they could act. He helped her. He didn't just help her, he spent money and time and called in whatever he could call in, and he got her out. To a new location. Under a new identity. A pause. He saved her life, Imani. I'm not overstating it. Those men were not the kind who issued warnings. Imani's hand had found its way to her own face without her noticing, palm pressed to her jaw, the physical self-steadying gesture of a person keeping their own structure intact. And after that, she said, what happened after that? He lost track of her, her grandmother said. He helped her disappear so well that he couldn't find her afterward. He tried, your mother told me later, much later, that she received one letter from someone she believed was from him, asking if she was all right. She didn't respond because she was afraid the letter had been intercepted. She was afraid of everything by then. Another pause. She came home in 1988. She had you in 1990. She was never right again after that year, Imani. You know that. She was always looking at doors. And then she left, Imani said. Her voice was very flat. And then she left, her grandmother confirmed. In 1997, you were 7. She told me there were people who had started looking again, and she couldn't bring them to our door. She couldn't bring them to you. Her voice did something then, caught, briefly, on a word she didn't say. I didn't agree with her decision. I have never agreed with it, but I have also never been certain she was wrong. Imani was on her floor and Seoul was outside her window, and her grandmother's voice was 7 hours and 9,000 kilometers away. And inside her chest there was a sensation she had no clean name for. Too large to be grief, too structured to be shock, too old to be surprise. It felt like something that had been true for a long time was simply finishing its process of becoming known. She could still be alive, Imani said. She was alive as of 4 years ago, her grandmother said quietly. I received something, a photograph, no return address, a street I didn't recognize. But her face, a pause. Her face. The silence between them was complete. He knew, Imani said. His son, Jae-hyun. He knew the connection and the file. He's been trying to find her. Perhaps, her grandmother said, or perhaps he's been trying to find you first, to make sure you were safe before he told you anything. Another pause. That is what his father would have done, Imani. I can't speak to the son. Imani sat on the floor for a long time after the call ended. She sat until the light outside her window had completed its shift from evening to full dark, until the room around her had settled into the particular quality of nighttime silence that was Seoul's version of quiet. Not still, never fully still, but reduced, contained, the city breathing at a lower register. The file wasn't surveillance. Or it was surveillance, but not the kind she had assumed. Not a powerful man assembling leverage. Not a project she'd been reduced to without her knowledge. It was something older and stranger, and in some ways more devastating. A promise that had traveled 30 years across 2 deaths and 1 long disappearance to land in a leather folder on a desk in a Seoul hotel suite. She needed to talk to him. She needed to talk to him, and she needed to do it before her composure finished reassembling itself into armor, because armor was useful and she was skilled with it. And it was also, she understood now with the clarity that came from sitting on floors in the dark, the thing most likely to prevent her from hearing whatever he was trying to say. She stood up. She picked up her phone. She typed, "Are you still at the hotel?" The response came back in under a minute. "Yes." She typed, "I need to see you. Tonight. 3 seconds. I'll be here." She put on her coat. She left her apartment and walked back through the Seoul night toward the Aurelia Grand, and she walked fast, with the specific energy of a woman who had made a decision and was committed to it before any countervailing instinct had time to mount an argument. She was 2 blocks from the hotel when her phone buzzed. Not Jae-hyun, a different number, one she didn't recognize, which she answered because she had apparently developed this reflex and hadn't gotten around to dismantling it. Miss Okoye. A man's voice, smooth, professionally calibrated, the specific vocal register of someone who delivered unwelcome information for a living. "My name is Park Sung-won. I'm a journalist. I believe you're familiar with my work." She stopped walking. "I have nothing to say to you." "I understand, but I think you'll want to hear what I have to say before your story appears tomorrow." A brief pause, timed for effect. "I have documentation, Ms. Okoye, not about your relationship with Kwon Jae-hyun. That was the warm-up piece. I have documentation about you specifically, about why Kwon Jae-hyun was actually looking for you." Another pause. "About your mother." The pavement under her feet was very solid. She was aware of it in detail. The specific texture of wet Seoul concrete under her shoes, the weight of her coat on her shoulders, the small halo of vapor her breath made in the night air. "What do you want?" she said. "A conversation," Park said. "Tonight, before anything goes to press." "I think that's fair, don't you?" She stood on the pavement. Behind her, the residential street. Ahead of her, the hotel's golden lights, 2 blocks away. In her phone, a man who had been paid by someone she knew to dismantle her life piece by piece, now claiming to have found the piece she hadn't known was missing. "Where?" she said. He named a bar in Jongno-gu, 15 minutes by cab. She looked at the hotel lights for a moment, then she turned around and walked to the main street and hailed a cab. She did not message Jae-hyun to tell him she was coming later. She did not message him to tell him what she had just discovered about his father and her mother, about the 30-year thread connecting 2 families who had never been supposed to meet again. What she did was get into the cab and look out the window as Seoul moved past, in its nighttime configuration, neon and shadow and the blur of other lives in motion, and she thought about her mother's face in a photograph her grandmother had received 4 years ago, standing on an unidentified street in an unidentified city, still alive, still hiding, still carrying the weight of a night in 1987 that had never finished happening. She thought, Adrian gave this journalist her name. Adrian had started this. Adrian, who had stood in a hotel lobby and watched her walk to dinner with a man he couldn't tolerate her being chosen by, had set a sequence in motion that was now threatening to expose not just her professional life, but her mother's location, her mother's safety, everything her grandmother had protected through 30 years of silence. The cab stopped outside the bar. She paid. She got out. She pushed open the door and stepped into the warm noise of the interior and scanned the room until she found Park Sung-won, mid-40s, a journalist's face, the kind that had once been idealistic and had since developed the particular pallor of a man who had made too many compromises and had stopped counting them. He saw her. He lifted a hand. She walked toward him, and she was not afraid, which was not bravery but something colder and more functional. She was past the point where fear was the primary operating system. She was running on something harder and older and more efficient than fear. She sat down across from him. "Show me what you have," she said. He opened a folder. She looked at the first page and her blood went very cold because it was not at all what she had been expecting. It was not about her mother's location. It was not about the 1987 connection to Kwon Dae-sung. It was a photograph of Kwon Jae-hyun, taken approximately 8 months ago in what appeared to be a private meeting room. Sitting across from him was a man in a gray suit whose face she did not recognize. Between them on the table was an open document that the angle of the photograph was not quite sufficient to read completely. But she could read the header. Okoye Imani Adaeze. Preliminary assessment, 8 months ago. 8 months before he had arrived at the Aurelia Grand. 8 months before the rain and the lobby and the pastries and mapogu and every conversation she had begun, against her considerable better judgment, to trust. 8 months. She looked at Park Sung-won across the small table. He was watching her with the specific attention of a man observing the moment an argument lands. He had the decency not to look satisfied. "How long?" she said. Her voice was very quiet. "The investigation into your background appears to have started 14 months ago," Park said. "The preliminary assessment was at 8 months. His arrival at your hotel was engineered," she said. Park said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She sat in the bar in Jongno-gu with the noise of other people's evenings moving around her like water around a stone, and she looked at the photograph, and she understood, with a totality that left no room for the kind of hopeful alternative readings she had been constructing all day, that the man she had been allowing herself, carefully and against her instincts, to begin to trust, had chosen her hotel deliberately, had chosen her, had walked into the Aurelia Grand, not because he needed a room someone else was responsible for, but because the room's director was a woman named Imani Okoye, whose file he had been building for over a year. Everything since then, the pastries, the umbrella, the noodle shop, the dinner, the carefully calibrated silences, and the precisely offered presences had occurred on top of that foundation. She closed the folder. She pushed it back across the table toward Park Sung-won with the flat, deliberate movement of a woman returning something she had never wanted. "What do you want for it?" she said. "Nothing from you," he said. "I want an interview with Kwon Jae-hyun. One interview on record. I've wanted it for 3 years. You have access to him that nobody else currently has. You arrange the interview, and you kill the story." "I hold the story," he said. "There's a distinction." She looked at him. She looked at the closed folder. She thought about her grandmother's voice on the phone an hour ago. He saved her life, Imani. And she thought about the leather folder on the desk in the suite. And she thought about the photograph she had just seen. And she tried to locate the place where these things could coexist in the same narrative without one of them being a lie. She couldn't find it. "Give me 24 hours, she said. "You have until tomorrow at 6 p.m., Park said. "After that, the story goes to my editor." She stood up. She put on her coat. She looked at Park Sung-won one final time, at the man Adrian Cho had purchased and aimed at her life. And she said very clearly, "If anything in that story references my family, I will make certain you never work in this city again. That is not a threat. It is information." She walked out of the bar into the Seoul night. She stood on the pavement outside and breathed, and the air was cold and tasted of the city, and her phone was in her hand, and Jae-hyun's last message was on the screen. "I'll be here." And she stared at it until the message until the screen timed out. Then she put the phone in her pocket and stood on the Jongno-gu pavement and made herself breathe in the way she'd learned to breathe when things were falling. Slowly, through the nose, counting to 4, because the body needed instruction when the mind was moving too fast for it to keep up on its own. 1, 2, 3, 4. The cold air went in and the warm air came out, and Seoul moved around her with its complete indifference to her specific catastrophe, which was, she had always found, one of the more useful properties of cities. They didn't accommodate your crisis. They simply continued, and the continuance had a kind of instruction in it. You also continue. She hailed a cab. She did not go to the hotel. She went home, and she sat at her kitchen table with her coat still on, and she opened her laptop, and she spent 2 hours doing something she had never done before. She researched Kwon Jae-hyun not as a professional exercise, but as a personal one. She went deeper than the financial coverage and the controlled public profile, deeper than the obituaries and the infrastructure reports, into the older material, the pre-digital archive stuff that had been scanned and uploaded by university researchers and historical databases. Korean business history, 1980s and 1990s, shipping routes, corporate structures, the companies that had been swallowed by larger companies that had been swallowed by larger companies still. At 11:47, she found a 3-paragraph mention in an academic paper on Korean corporate consolidation. A footnote, essentially. A reference to Kwon Dae-sung's legal troubles in the late 1980s. A brief entanglement with a business partner whose other activities had attracted the attention of people who were not interested in business. The paper described it as resolved without formal charges. It did not describe how it had been resolved. She closed the laptop. She sat at the kitchen table with her coat on and looked at the middle distance. He had started investigating her 14 months ago. He had arrived at her hotel 8 months after that preliminary assessment. He had spent the intervening 6 months doing what? Building a more comprehensive file? Deciding on an approach? She thought about the photograph Park had shown her, Jae-hyun across the table from the man in the gray suit, the document between them with her name on it. She thought about the precision of everything that had followed his arrival. The pastries, timed for impact. The umbrella, timed for impact. The dinner, chosen to disarm. The carefully offered silences that she had read as emotional intelligence and now needed to reconsider as strategic patience. She also thought about his father. She also thought about her mother. She sat with both of these things for a long time, trying to determine whether they could occupy the same space, whether a promise made 30 years ago could be the foundation of something that was also a manipulation, whether a man could carry real intention inside a false architecture, and whether that distinction mattered when the effect on her was identical. She decided, sometime around 1 in the morning, that she didn't have enough information to decide, and that she was going to get it. She set her alarm for 6, and she lay down on her bed with her coat still on, and she did not sleep for approximately 90 minutes, and then she did. She was in the hotel by 7. Min-seok started toward her with his usual morning briefing energy, and she stopped him with a look. Not unkind, but complete, that communicated without words that this was not the morning for briefings. He pivoted smoothly to the overnight report and left it on her desk, and she was grateful for him in the specific way you were grateful for colleagues who understood the difference between support and presence. She had one thing to do before Jae-hyun woke up, and it required the front desk. She pulled the hotel's guest registration system. Kwon Jae-hyun's booking had been made through a corporate account. Standard for a guest of his profile. Nothing unusual. She traced the booking back through the reservation chain, which was routine and took 4 minutes. She was looking for the date of first contact with the hotel, not the confirmation date, the first inquiry. The first inquiry had been made 14 months ago, the same month as the preliminary assessment in Park's photograph. She sat back in her chair. The booking had been made 14 months ago and held, renewed quietly, 3 times, against the hotel's forward calendar, waiting for the right moment, or waiting for whatever prerequisite Jae-hyun had required to be satisfied before he arrived in person. She thought, so he was ready for this. He prepared for this the way he prepared for everything, thoroughly, patiently, with a timeline that most people wouldn't have the temperament for. He had decided 14 months ago that he was going to find Imani Okoye. He had spent those 14 months making certain he knew exactly who he was going to find before he found her. The question that she hadn't been able to answer at 1 in the morning and still couldn't answer now was, why? His father's promise was part of it. She believed that. What she didn't yet know was whether the promise was all of it or whether there was something else inside the architecture. Something about the file, about the specific detail of what was in it, about the red annotation next to her mother's name that she hadn't been able to parse in the suite because her vision had gone strange. She needed to see that file again, and she needed to do it with him in the room. She called his room at 8:15. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant either he was an early riser or he had been waiting. I need to talk to you, she said. Now. A pause. I'll come down. No, she said. I'll come up. She rode the elevator to the 14th floor for the second time in as many days, and this time she knocked. He opened the door wearing a plain gray shirt and the same kind of carefully assembled composure she was wearing, which told her that he understood this was not a casual conversation. He stepped back to let her in. She walked past him into the suite and went directly to the desk. The folder was still there, in the same position, the same degree of openness. She turned and looked at him. He was standing near the door, not having moved further into the room, giving her the space. She noticed this. She filed it in the part of her mind that was still collecting data rather than acting on it. 14 months, she said. His expression didn't change. This was information. If he'd been surprised she knew, the expression would have moved. Yes, he said. The booking for this hotel, the preliminary assessment, the file. She kept her voice even. 14 months. He crossed the room and sat down in the chair near the window. Not at the desk, not between her and the folder, not positioning himself in any way that controlled the space. He sat and he looked at her with that full, unhurried attention, and he said, "What do you want to know?" "Everything," she said, starting with why. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man constructing a lie. She had been watching people construct lies professionally for years, and she knew the specific quality of that silence, the way the eyes moved slightly upward and to the right, the way the breathing changed. This was the silence of a man deciding how to tell something true in a way that it could be heard. "My father died 11 years ago," he said. "He left me 2 things, the company and a letter." A pause. The letter described a woman he had met in Hong Kong in 1987. A South African woman who had witnessed something she shouldn't have witnessed and had been placed in danger because of it. He wrote that he had helped her disappear, but that he had never been able to confirm she was safe afterward. He spent years trying to find her. He never did. He looked at Imani steadily. He asked me, in the letter, to complete what he hadn't been able to find the woman, or if she was gone, to find her family, to make certain they were all right, to offer whatever he hadn't been able to offer her. Security, closure, help, if it was needed. Imani's hands were at her sides. She was very still. "That was 11 years ago," she said. "Why did you wait?" "I didn't wait," he said. "I looked. The trail was 30 years old by the time I started following it. It moved slowly." A pause. 3 years ago, I found a record connecting the woman my father described to a family in Johannesburg. 2 years ago, I had a name. 14 months ago, I had yours." She walked to the desk. She put her hand on the folder. "The red annotation," she said, "next to my mother's name. What does it mean?" He looked at her hand on the folder. It means the trail doesn't end with you, he said. It means she may still be findable. The room was very quiet. My grandmother told me last night, Imani said. About Hong Kong, about your father. She paused. She told me your father saved my mother's life. Something moved in his face, brief and real. The specific movement of a person hearing their parent described in a way that cost something. Yes, he said. That's accurate. She looked at him for a long time. She was running two processes simultaneously. The one that was taking in what he was saying and weighing it against everything she knew, and the one that was holding Park Sung-won's photograph at the front of her mind, keeping it visible, refusing to let the warmth of this explanation dissolve what she had seen. Both processes were necessary. She trusted neither of them fully. There's a journalist, she said, Park Sung-won. She watched his face. Something tightened. Not guilt, not fear, but recognition. The jaw. The slight compression around the eyes. He showed me a photograph last night, she said. You and another man, 8 months ago. A document on the table between you with my name on it. She paused. He says you engineered your stay here, that you chose this hotel because I was here. Yes, he said. One word, just yes. No elaboration, no preemptive defensive construction. She waited. I chose this hotel because you were here, he said. I wanted to meet you in a context where you had professional standing, and I had none. Where the power differential was yours. He looked at her steadily. I thought it would be easier, less alarming than approaching you directly. I thought that if you encountered me in your professional environment, on your terms, you would have... He paused. Ground. You thought you'd make it comfortable for me to be a project, she said. I thought I'd make it possible for me to become a person to you before I became an obligation, he said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not emotion exactly, but the proximity of it, the outline of something he was holding close to the surface. She looked at him. That's a distinction, she said. Whether it's a real one, I don't know yet. I know, he said. I understand. She picked up the folder. She held it in both hands. She looked at the first page, her own name, clean and printed, the column of dates that documented her life assembled by someone else's determination to find her. She said, Park Sung-won wants an interview with you in exchange for holding the story. He has enough material to produce serious coverage, not just about us, but potentially about my family, about my mother. Jae-hyun's expression shifted, fully, this time, the composure moving aside to reveal something harder and more immediate underneath. What material? I don't know the full scope. He showed me the photograph of you in the document. He referenced my mother's situation. She set the folder back on the desk. He was paid by Adrian Cho to start digging, but he's a journalist. What Adrian paid him to find and what he actually found may be two different things. Jae-hyun stood up from the chair. The movement was controlled, but it had an energy beneath it. The specific quality of a man who had just received information that required action and was deciding on the speed. Adrian Cho doesn't know about your mother, he said. He can't. That information isn't in any accessible database I know, she said. Which means either Park found it independently or someone else provided it. She paused. How many people have access to that file? He looked at her. The gray morning light from the window was behind him, and his face was very clear, and she could see him running the same calculation she was, arriving at the same place. 2, he said. Myself and the investigator. A pause. A man named Shin. The man in the photograph. Yes. She let the implication sit in the room. She watched him let it sit. She watched his jaw tighten and release and tighten again. I need to make a call, he said. Make it, she said, but not here and not on a line that's been active in this hotel for the past week. He looked at her for a moment, a look that had something in it she would have, a week ago, described as respect. She still thought it was respect. She was simply no longer certain that respect and honesty had been operating together. He picked up his jacket. He left the room. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, and then the elevator, and then nothing. She sat down in the chair he had vacated, next to the window, with Seoul spread out 14 floors below her in its gray morning configuration. She sat with her hands in her lap and breathed. Her phone buzzed. Not Jae-hyun. Adrian. She stared at his name on the screen with a feeling that had moved well past heartbreak into something cleaner and more focused. Fury, yes, but under the fury, something structural. The understanding that Adrian Cho had not simply humiliated her on a rainy Tuesday night. He had, in the process of trying to punish her for being wanted by a man he couldn't tolerate her being chosen by, put her mother in danger. Whether he knew that or not was almost irrelevant. She answered, Imani. His voice was careful, the controlled version, the one he used in professional contexts. I know what you did, she said. I know you contacted Park Sung-won. I know you provided the photograph and the initial information. A pause. I was concerned. Stop. Her voice came out flat and very cold. Adrian, stop talking and listen to me. Whatever you told Park Sung-won, whatever you gave him, you need to understand that you have touched something that goes beyond you and me and your ego, and whatever it is you've been trying to accomplish this week, you put someone at risk who has nothing to do with us. What are you? My family, she said. Someone in my family whose location is not public and who requires it to stay that way. A pause. If Park publishes anything that compromises that, I will hold you personally responsible. Not metaphorically. I will retain a lawyer and I will make certain that responsibility is on record. The silence on his end had a different quality now. The controlled composure receding to reveal something beneath it. Not guilt, necessarily. Alarm. I didn't know about any family situation, he said. I gave him your professional background. And the photograph of you outside that restaurant. You gave a tabloid journalist a starting point and told him to dig, she said. What he dug up is your responsibility. She hung up. She sat for a moment. Then she opened her phone and called Min Seok. I need you to run the hotel this morning, she said. I have a situation that requires my full attention. You have full operational authority until I tell you otherwise. Understood, he said without asking questions. She had always valued this about him. She stood up. She looked at the folder on the desk one last time. Then she left the suite and took the stairs rather than the elevator because she needed the physical act of moving under her own power, needed her legs under her and the sound of her own footsteps. She came out into the lobby through the service corridor and stopped. Adrian was standing at the front desk, not requesting anything, just standing there in the lobby of her hotel at 8:45 in the morning with the specific stance of a man who had decided that showing up in person was his best remaining option. He turned when she came through the door, and for a moment they looked at each other across 30 feet of Italian marble. He looked bad. She registered this dispassionately. He hadn't slept. His jacket was the wrong one for the morning, grabbed in a hurry. The careful presentation she had always associated with him had developed a hairline fracture running through it. He crossed the lobby toward her. She didn't move. We need to talk, he said. Properly. Not on the phone. We don't, she said. Imani, I didn't know. I heard you, she said. Outside this lobby. In the rain. I heard everything you said. She kept her voice completely even. Around them, the lobby was running its morning operations. 2 staff at the desk, a bellman near the entrance, 3 guests crossing toward the restaurant. She was aware of all of them, and she was not going to give any of them a scene. You described me to a friend as too fat and too dark. You spent 2 years in a relationship with a woman you were apparently embarrassed by, and then when you saw that she might have value in someone else's eyes, you tried to destroy her. She paused. Which one of those things would you like to explain? He opened his mouth, closed it. The controlled version was failing in real time. She could see it, the careful architecture of Adrian Cho's self-presentation developing stress fractures. I made a mistake, he said. Several, she said, but we're not here to catalog them. She took 1 step closer. Adrian, call Park Sung-won. Today. Tell him the story is dead. Tell him whatever you need to tell him to make certain he understands that he will receive no further cooperation from you. If he publishes anything about my family, I will pursue this legally, and your name will be on every document. You can't. I can, she said, and you know I can because you know me. You spent 2 years with me, and you got most of it wrong, but you got this right. I don't make threats. I'm not prepared to execute. She looked at him steadily. This is the last conversation we will have. Make the call. She turned and walked back toward the service corridor, and she heard him behind her. Heard him not following. Heard instead the specific silence of a man receiving a verdict he had, on some level, already been expecting. She pushed through the service door and stood in the back corridor with the sound of the kitchen operations filtering through the wall beside her. The clanking and the voices and the industrial rhythm of a hotel breakfast service. And she stood there and breathed. Her phone rang. Jae-hyun. Where are you? He said. Service corridor, ground floor. Come up. A pause. And in the pause there was something new. An urgency he was keeping inside the control. The way you kept pressure inside a sealed line. Shin didn't take the information to Park. Shin was contacted by Park. Park has a source inside my corporate structure. Someone who has had access to investigation materials for at least 3 months. Another pause. This is larger than what either of us assumed. She pushed off the wall. How large? Large enough that I need to show you something, he said. And large enough that you need to see it before 6 o'clock tonight. Because after 6, if Park publishes, the decision gets made for us. She was already moving toward the elevator. I'm coming up. She stepped in. Hit 14. Watched the doors close on the lobby and felt the elevator lift her, and in the 18 seconds of that ascent she held everything simultaneously. Her mother's face in a photograph no one was supposed to have. Jae-hyun's voice saying 2. The file on the desk. Adrian in the lobby with his hairline fracture, Park's deadline ticking 6 hours away. Held all of it without letting any single piece collapse into the others. The doors opened. He was waiting in this corridor, not in the suite, standing outside the door with his phone in one hand and an expression she hadn't seen before. Not composed, not the specific gravity she had categorized as his baseline. Something had broken through the composure, and it was not panic. It was, she thought, as close as a man like Kwon Jae-hyun got to panic, which meant it still looked like controlled urgency, but with the temperature higher than anything she'd seen from him. My source inside the corporate structure, he said. I know who it is. She stopped in front of him. Who? A man who has been with the company for 9 years, he said. A man who was with my father before that. A man who had access to the early investigation materials because I trusted him. His jaw was tight. Who also had access to information about your mother's last known location. Had, she said. Past tense. I cut his access at 6 this morning when I traced the leak. His eyes were very direct. But the information was already out. Park has it. What Park does with it depends on the next 6 hours. He paused. And on what I decide to do, which is going to require telling you something I was not ready to tell you yet. Something I should have told you before I ever walked into this hotel. She looked at him. The corridor was empty. The fluorescent lights hummed their single note. 14 floors below them, Seoul was going about its enormous, indifferent business. Then tell me, she said. He looked at her for a long moment with the specific expression of a man standing at the edge of something he has calculated and still doesn't know the landing of. Your mother, he said. She's not in Malaysia. The corridor air was very still. I know where she is, he said. I've known for 4 months. I've been trying to determine whether approaching her was safe, whether making contact would expose her. His voice was very controlled, and underneath the control was something that was not control at all. And I didn't tell you because I hadn't yet told you about the file, and I hadn't told you about the file because I was... He stopped. Because I was afraid that if you knew the truth about how I found you, you wouldn't let me. Say it, she said. Her voice was barely above quiet. Wouldn't let me stay, he said. Wouldn't let this be anything other than an obligation I was completing. The silence between them had a quality she hadn't encountered before in any of their silences. Not neutral, not textured, but raw. The specific rawness of two people standing in a moment that has stripped away every secondary layer and left only the essential thing, which was also the most terrifying thing, which was that nothing between them could be uncomplicated, and nothing between them could be simple, and yet here they were. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A message from a number she'd never seen. 3 words. I see you. She looked up at Jae-hyun. His expression had changed. He had looked at his own phone, which had buzzed simultaneously, And what she saw on his face was the specific look of a man who has just understood that the timeline has moved without his permission. "Park," he said. "Or whoever is feeding Park," she said. He looked at her. "We have less than 6 hours." "Then stop explaining," she said, "and start doing." He looked at her for one more second, 1 second in which something passed between them that was not a decision so much as a recognition, the acknowledgement of two people who had been circling the same gravity for days and had just run out of orbital distance. Then he moved. He went into the suite, and she followed, and the door closed behind them. And outside the window, 14 floors above the city, the Seoul morning had developed into something overcast and pressing, the sky lowering itself toward the streets with the specific atmospheric intention of a city that was... The suite became a war room in under 4 minutes. Jae-hyun was on his phone before the door finished closing, speaking in rapid Korean to someone who answered immediately. The kind of immediate that meant the person on the other end had been waiting for this call. Imani moved to the desk and opened the folder, and this time she read it properly, all of it, without the distortion of shock. She read with the focused attention she brought to crisis management, absorbing the structure of the information, mapping its shape, identifying what was confirmed and what was inferred and where the gaps were. Her mother's name appeared on page 7. Adeze Okoye, born Johannesburg, 1964. The annotation in red that she hadn't been able to parse 2 nights ago was a date. 4 months ago. Below the date, 2 lines of text she could now read clearly. Subject located, Kuala Lumpur, Damansara Heights District. Identity, Amara Suleiman. Status, stable. Approach pending authorization. Pending authorization. He had found her mother 4 months ago and had been waiting. For what exactly? She was now in a position to understand. Waiting to tell Imani first. Waiting to be something other than a file and an obligation before he handed her the most significant information of her life. She looked at the date again. 4 months. He had carried this for 4 months. She set the folder down and turned, and he was still on the phone, standing at the window with his back to her, his voice low and precise. She watched his shoulders. She had learned in the past week to read him through his body when his face was unavailable, and what his shoulders said right now was that the call was not going well, but was also not catastrophic. The shoulders of a man managing a difficult situation, not collapsing under one. He hung up. He turned. "Park received a file this morning," he said, "directly to his personal email. It contains your mother's current identity and general location. Whoever sent it wanted to make certain that even if we neutralized Park, the information was already loose." He paused. "It came from an address associated with a Shell account, but the metadata traces back to a server my company used to use 3 years ago. Someone saved access they shouldn't have kept." "Shin," she said. "Shin was one conduit," he said, "but Shin was being used. The person who originally built the access architecture, so the person who has had passive visibility into my investigations for 3 years, is someone I have been working with since my father's time." He stopped. The jaw moved. "A man named Oh Byung-hwan. He was my father's personal attorney. He became mine. He has had access to the family's private matters for over 20 years. "Why?" she said. "What does he gain from exposing your mother's location?" "Not your mother," he said. "Me." He moved away from the window. "Oh has known about my father's promise for years. He processed the estate letter personally. He also knows that if I fulfill that promise, if I find your mother, provide her with safety and resources, formalize any kind of legal or financial protection, there are tax and asset implications that affect the company structure he has managed for decades." He paused. "He is 71 years old. He is 3 years from the retirement arrangement we agreed on. He decided that the risk of what I might do with this investigation outweighed the arrangement. So he burned it," she said. "He burned it," he confirmed. She looked at him. "Can you stop Park from publishing?" "I can offer Park the interview he's been requesting for 3 years," he said, "but it needs to be now, today, on the phone within the hour if possible, and it needs to be real. He will know if I'm managing him." "He will know anyway," she said. "He's good at his job." "Yes," he said, "which means the interview needs to offer him something worth more than the story he has." He looked at her steadily. "Which means telling him the truth." the actual truth. My father's promise, the investigation, the connection between our families. I tell him on record, not the tabloid version, not the speculation version, the real version. A pause. It removes the sensationalism. It makes the story about a 30-year-old debt between two families instead of about a billionaire and a hotel employee. She was quiet for a moment. It exposes my family history. Yes, he said. I know. That's your decision, not mine. I won't make that call without you. She turned to the window. Below, Seoul was living its morning, a bus pulling away from the stop across the street, two people sharing an umbrella at the corner, a delivery van with its hazard lights blinking in the leftmost lane. Ordinary, specific, indifferent. The city carrying on. Her mother had been living under another name for 29 years. Had been Amara Suleiman in a Kuala Lumpur neighborhood for long enough that the name had probably stopped feeling like a disguise. Had been alive and functioning and hidden and... Imani tried to hold this thought carefully. Probably afraid for 29 years. The particular sustained fear of a person who had seen what the world could do and had spent 3 decades making certain it couldn't reach her child. Tell him, she said. Jae-hyun looked at her. Tell Park the truth, she said. All of it. But I want to speak to my grandmother first. I want her to know what's coming before it's public. She turned from the window. Give me 30 minutes. He nodded. No questions. She went to the far end of the suite, to the small sitting area near the secondary window, and she called her grandmother. Noma answered in 2 rings. It's moving faster than I thought, Imani said. Someone leaked information about Mama's location to a journalist. We're managing it, but the story may come out regardless. Not the tabloid version, but the real version. Our version. She paused. I needed you to know. Her grandmother was quiet for a moment. Then, will she be safe? We're working on that. Imani. Her grandmother's voice had the quality it got when she was about to say something she had been holding for a long time. Your mother left because she believed the danger to you was real. She has spent 30 years believing that her absence was protecting you. A pause. If this comes out, if her name is connected to yours publicly, she will know you've been found. She will know the thing she feared most has happened. Another pause. She will also know you're still here, still standing. A breath on the line, slow and deliberate. I have thought for 29 years that she needs to know that more than she needs the hiding. Imani pressed her free hand flat against the window glass. The surface was cold against her palm. Outside, the overcast sky had begun to produce a light rain. The first of the day, arriving without particular drama, simply beginning. I'll call you when it's done, she said. She went back to Jae-hyun. Make the call, she said. The interview with Park Sung-won lasted 47 minutes. Jae-hyun sat at the desk with his phone on speaker, and Imani sat across the room, close enough to be present, but outside the frame of the conversation, and she listened to Kwon Jae-hyun do something she had not expected. He spoke plainly, not with the polished control of a man managing a media narrative, with the specific plainness of a person who had decided that the truth, told without decoration, was more defensible than any crafted version of it. He told Park about the letter, about his father's account of a young South African woman in a Hong Kong corridor in 1987, about the men who had wanted her, about the decision his father had made. He told him about the 11 years of searching, about the trail going cold and being picked up and going cold again. He told him about the 14 months and the file and his decision to come to the Aurelia Grand. He did not tell him where Imani's mother was. He told him only that she was alive, and that her location and identity were being protected, and that they would remain so, and that any publication of identifying information would be met with every legal mechanism available. Park listened. He asked questions. Good ones, the kind that came from genuine journalistic instinct rather than tactical maneuvering. Jae-hyun answered them. When Park asked about Imani directly, Jae-hyun said, "She is the reason I completed what my father started. That's the accurate and entire description." When the call ended, Park said, "I'll need 48 hours to restructure the piece." "You have them," Jae-hyun said. "And the interview, a proper one. 30 minutes, on record, within the month." "Yes." The call ended. The suite was very quiet. Imani looked at Jae-hyun across the room. He set the phone down and looked back at her. Neither of them said anything immediately, which was its own form of communication, the specific silence of two people who had just done something that could not be undone and were sitting with the weight of that. "Oh Byung-hwan," she said finally. "I've terminated his access to everything. My legal team is reviewing the retention arrangement." He paused. "He's 71. He served my father well for many years. I won't pursue criminal charges for what is essentially an act of fear by an old man." Another pause. "But I will make certain he understands what his fear nearly cost." She nodded. "And Adrian," she said. Jae-hyun looked at his desk. "Adrian Cho's professional reputation is going to have a difficult few months regardless," he said. "The story Park publishes will make it clear that the smear campaign originated with him. Park is not inclined to protect him." He paused. "I'm not going to do anything beyond that." "Neither am I," she said. "I already said what needed saying." She stood up. She walked to the window and stood there and looked at the rain, which had thickened slightly since the morning, which was still not the heavy rain of Tuesday night, but something quieter and more continuous. She thought about standing in that lobby glass watching Adrian's arms go around a woman, about the words that had come through the revolving door and found her on the pavement, about the specific quality of that silence and what it had asked of her. She thought, that was 8 days ago. 8 days. And the woman who had stood in that rain had been required to absorb more information than most people processed in a year. About a man she had loved and misjudged, about a man she had guarded against and might still be misjudging, about a mother she had spent 29 years constructing theories of and was now going to have to revise completely. She thought, I am still standing, not as a triumph, just as a fact. "I need to go to Kuala Lumpur," she said. Jae-hyun behind her said nothing. "Not for a while, not immediately." She paused. "I need to call first, and I need to do that alone." She turned from the window. "I don't need you to arrange it. I need to do that part myself." "Yes," he said. "I need you to give me the contact information, the address, everything in that file that relates to her current situation." She held his gaze. "And I need to know that you won't make any contact with her before I do." "I won't," he said. "I was always going to give you that. That was never in question." She looked at him for a long moment. "I believe you," she said. And she did. Not completely, not without reservation, not in the uncomplicated way she would have believed him before the suite and the photograph and the journalist bar in Jongno-gu. But she believed him in the way you believed things that had been tested and had held under the testing, which was a different kind of belief, and in some ways a more durable one. "There are things I still need to understand," she said. "About the 14 months, about the choices you made. I'm not putting this away in a folder and considering it resolved." She paused. "But I'm also not walking away from it. I don't know what it is yet. I know that I'm not walking away from it." He looked at her across the room. The morning light was behind her from the window, and she was standing in it with her coat on and her braids still exact from the morning, and he looked at her with that full, unhurried attention that she had spent 8 days reading and misreading and reading again, and said, "That's enough, that's—" He stopped, started again. "That's more than I expected." "Don't get ahead of yourself," she said. Something that was fully, finally, a smile crossed his face. Brief, real. "No," he said. Adrian Cho called twice more that week. She let both calls go, and then, on Thursday, she answered. "I called Park," he said. He sounded tired in the way that people sounded when they had been carrying something they'd told themselves wasn't heavy and had recently been disabused of the fiction. "I told him we're done." "Good," she said. A pause. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what I said. Outside the hotel." Another pause. I know it doesn't fix anything." She thought about what to say and discarded several things before she found the one that was accurate. "It doesn't fix anything," she agreed, "but it's the right thing to say. So say it to yourself until you mean it, not just as an apology to me, but as something you understand about yourself." She paused. "Because the problem wasn't me, Adrian. You know that. The problem was what you believed you were entitled to and what you thought you were allowed to do with a person who didn't fit inside it." A long silence. "Yeah," he said finally. His voice was very flat, the particular flatness of a man receiving an accurate verdict. She hung up. She sat at her desk and looked at the hotel's weekly operations summary on her monitor and thought, that is finished. Not resolved, not forgiven, not converted into something useful. Finished. The way certain things needed to be finished, completely, without residue, without the performance of ongoing grievance. She went back to work. 3 weeks later, she sat on her apartment floor again. Not in distress this time, just on the floor because the leather armchair was behind her and she was using it as a backrest, and the phone was in her hands and she was doing the thing she had been building toward for 21 days. She had the address in her phone's notes. A street in Damansara Heights that she had looked at on a map so many times in the past 3 weeks that she could have described the adjacent intersections from memory. She had a name, Amara Suleiman, that she had said aloud, alone, in her apartment, several times, so that she would not stumble over it when the moment came. She had the phone number. Jae-hyun had given it to her without comment, and she had held it in her phone's notes for 21 days without using it, and tonight she was going to use it. She dialed. It rang 4 times. Then 5. She was constructing the possibility of voicemail, what she would say, whether she would say anything, whether a voicemail was the appropriate first contact for a conversation 29 years overdue, when the call connected. A breath, then a voice. Imani closed her eyes. She had spent 29 years building her mother's voice from incomplete materials. Photographs, her grandmother's descriptions, one recording from a home video made in 1995 that she had listened to so many times she had worn the memory of it thin. She had assembled a voice from those materials that was part fact and part construction, a composite her mind had produced in the absence of the real thing. The voice on the phone was different from the composite. It was older and quieter, and had an accent that had changed. The Johannesburg rhythm still there underneath, but overlaid with 29 years of elsewhere. It was real, which meant it was strange, which meant it was more difficult and more complete than anything she had imagined. "Hello?" the voice said again. Imani opened her eyes. "Mama," she said. "It's me." The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. She counted them, and in those 4 seconds she heard, through the silence, the specific sound of a person understanding that the thing they had been afraid of and the thing they had been hoping for had arrived simultaneously, in the same moment, in the same voice. Then a sound that was not a word, a sound that came from somewhere below language, from the part of a person that remembered before it remembered anything else. Imani pressed her palm flat against her sternum and felt her own heartbeat there, faster than it should have been and completely human and absolutely alive. "I'm here," she said. "I'm here." She flew to Kuala Lumpur 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, alone. She took a cab from the airport to a street in Damansara Heights, and paid the driver and stood on the pavement in front of a building that was neither remarkable nor unremarkable. A low apartment block with a courtyard, jasmine growing along the fence, a bicycle locked to the gatepost. She stood there for 2 minutes before she went in. The woman who answered the door was 60 years old and small and had Imani's eyes exactly, the same shape and the same depth and the same quality of looking at things directly, and she had been crying before she opened the door, which meant she had watched Imani coming through the courtyard from the window. They stood in the doorway. There were no speeches. There was no cinematic collapse of one into the other, no dramatic embrace that resolved 29 years in a single gesture. That was not what either of them was, or what the moment required. What happened instead was this. Imani's mother stepped back, and Imani stepped forward into the apartment, and the door closed behind them, and they sat down at a small kitchen table that had a pot of tea on it that was already brewed. "You look like your grandmother," her mother said. "Everyone says that," Imani said. "It's true." A pause. Her mother's hands were wrapped around her cup. She was looking at Imani with the specific intensity of a person who has been given something they'd written off as permanently lost and doesn't yet know how to hold it. "You're taller than I expected." "You're shorter." A small sound from her mother. Not quite a laugh, but the structural predecessor to one. The same almost smile that Imani had, the one that appeared before the actual expression committed itself. They sat with the tea and the morning light coming through the kitchen window, and outside the courtyard was doing its ordinary business. A cat crossing the space, someone on the floor above moving furniture, the sound of a scooter on the adjacent street. "I need to tell you something," her mother said. Her voice was careful, the voice of a person who had had 29 years to rehearse and still wasn't sure of the words. "What I did, leaving, I need you to know that I—" "Not today," Imani said. Her mother looked at her. "There's time for that," Imani said. "We have time. That's what's different now. We have time." She paused. "Today I just want to sit here." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. The eyes that were Imani's eyes filled, and Imani watched her blink it back. The same refusal, the same stubborn, self-preserving maintenance of composure. And for a moment it was almost funny in the specific way that only painful things are funny when you see yourself reflected in the source of them. "All right," her mother said. All right. They sat. She returned to Seoul on a Friday and went directly from the airport to the hotel and dealt with 4 outstanding operational issues before noon, which was either professional dedication or the way she had always processed large emotional events. By returning immediately to the competence that had been the one constant in her life since she was 7 years old and had needed something to hold on to. Probably both. Jae-hyun had not contacted her during the week she was in Kuala Lumpur. One message on the day she landed. Safe flight, nothing after. She had found this when she thought about it on the 3rd night while her mother showed her photographs of a neighborhood she had lived in for 11 years before moving to Damansara, correctly calibrated. The right amount of present and the right amount of absent. She had filed it alongside the other data she was still assembling about who he was. She messaged him on Friday evening from her office. "I'm back. 3 minutes. How was it?" She thought for a moment, then, "Complicated. True. Worth it." A pause. Then, "Yes." She looked at the word for a moment. Then she put her phone in her pocket and finished her paperwork and turned off her desk lamp and stood for a moment in the dark of her office with the Seoul nighttime doing its thing outside the window. The city at full brightness, the grid of lit windows, the movement of people and vehicles, and the 10,000 ordinary lives running simultaneously in all directions. She was 41 days from the night she had stood in the rain outside this building and heard 2 sentences that had taken what she thought she knew about herself and demonstrated, not kindly, how much of it had been borrowed from other people's definitions. She was 41 days from the woman who had walked away from those 2 sentences into the dark and told herself it was a controlled exit, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had been walking away from that particular wound her entire adult life, and the rain had simply made it visible. She was still walking, but in a different direction now. On ground she had chosen. She put on her coat and went downstairs through the lobby where all of it had begun. The marble floor and the concierge desk, and the entrance through which a man had arrived one morning, and not rushed and not performed, and had looked at the room as though looking were worth taking seriously. The night manager nodded. She nodded back. She pushed through the revolving door into the Seoul evening. The air was cold and clear and carried the particular smell of the city after rain, something mineral and alive, the smell of stone that had been wet and was now drying. She stood on the pavement and breathed it in. Behind her, the revolving door turned again, and she heard his footsteps, unhurried, recognizable. And then he was standing beside her on the pavement, not touching, not explaining, simply standing next to her the way you stood next to someone when you had decided that next to was where you were going to be. She didn't look at him immediately. She looked at the street. "I'm not finished being angry," she said. "I know," he said. "About the 14 months, about the way you approached it. I know. That's going to take time." "I have time," he said. "I have—" He paused, and in the pause she could hear him choosing, the same care she was coming to recognize as one of the most consistent things about him. "I have whatever amount of time you need." She looked at him then. He was looking at the street. In the hotel's light and the neon and the ambient blaze of the city, his face was its usual composed thing, but she had gotten better at reading beneath the composition, had learned the specific inventory of what it covered and what it genuinely was. She read him now as a man who was not performing patience, who was simply, actually patient. "My mother is going to contact a lawyer in Kuala Lumpur," she said. to begin the process of clarifying her legal status. I've been researching what that involves. If you need resources, I'll ask, she said. If I need them, I'll ask. A pause. I'm not accepting a solution that I didn't decide to accept. Understood, he said, the word landing cleanly, without friction. She looked at the street again. A couple walked past with a small dog pulling at the leash toward an interesting smell. Two teenagers on the corner were looking at something on a phone and arguing about it. A taxi paused to let out a woman in a red coat who paid the driver and disappeared through a building door. Ordinary, specific, true. I'm hungry, she said. He looked at her, the almost smile. There's a place in Mapogu, he said. I know, she said. I've been there. The soup is better on Fridays. That's not a thing. It is. The owner uses a different broth stock on Friday. It takes 30 hours. She looked at him. He was looking at the street again with the specific expression of a man making a careful effort not to look like he was waiting for anything, which was how she could tell he was waiting for everything. All right, she said. They walked. Not close enough to touch? Not yet, because some distances needed to be closed in the right order and at the right speed. And she had spent enough of her life moving at other people's pace to have become particular about this. But they walked in the same direction on the same pavement through the Seoul Friday night, and the city moved around them with its magnificent indifference, and the rain that had been threatening all day had apparently decided not to arrive after all. Which was fine. She had an umbrella. She had chosen it herself.